Everyday Samurai, Episode 60. Greetings, friends, and welcome to Everyday Samurai, in service to your liberty and the security of a free state. How do you do? Thank you for joining us once again for an exploration of the principles of mindset, martial art, and the science of political economy, organized and optimized to bring about a greater good for everyone through the principles of law, justice, and what makes for prosperity. Right now there is a lot of conflict in the world. I think that it's exacerbated by the speed with which information flows through social media and news outlets. Never before in humanity's history has information been so accessible, and that, of course, like all things, is a double-edged sword. It can cut both ways. It can empower or it can distract. And distraction is one of the greatest dangers to your livelihood, your personal liberty, but also your physical security. And remaining focused, present in the here and now, not attached to any one data point, is one of the key insights of the samurai. To be fully present and to not allow any one thing to draw your focus is a key insight in all of the Zen and sword-based manuals that you find in Japanese martial art history. So focusing on principles that do bring about desired results is one of the key aspects of living the martial way, not spending your time on distractions and focusing on what you need to do to improve your mental, physical, spiritual, and situational conditions is one of those aspects that separates the warrior from the subject. So this will be a reading that continues in Chapter 3 of Dr. Edwin Vieira Jr.'s By Tyranny Out of Necessity, the Bastardy of Martial Law, which discusses why there is a building police state. And we see this now in 2024 more than ever in a post-Charlie 19er environment. World Health Organization treaties being negotiated, former political office holders being persecuted for what are obviously politically motivated charges. Things along those lines all coalesce with the understanding that the police state, a state in which the police control the weapons and enforce the dictates of the political oligarchs through a technocratic means, are becoming all the more apparent and obvious. So rather than focusing on the problem too much, we focus on the solution. The solution, of course, is to secure a free state. In order to do that, it requires the whole body of the people, except for public officials, to be organized, armed, and disciplined. In other words, a free people must be disciplined in the armed martial arts and actively engaged in executing a common law that holds everyone accountable. So the problem is a lack of discipline on the part of the average citizen that doesn't recognize the responsibilities in securing a free state. So when we train in the martial arts, when we study the principles of political economy to know when the use of force is justified and legitimate, it is with the intent of not only securing ourselves, but also inculcating a culture of discipline that observes and upholds the law. These things cannot be left to politicians and bureaucrats. They are entirely too incentivized to fall prey to corruption, not only for their own enrichment and aggrandizement, but for the benefit of those that are pulling the strings behind the scene. And we don't want to dwell too much on what they are doing. We want to focus more on what we are doing to advance ourselves, to improve our own personal situation, and also being strong enough to make a contribution to the type of society that works for the rule of law. And that is not only in alignment with the principles of political economy, but also those Enlightenment thoughts that gave birth to the shot heard round the world in terms of self-government rather than being governed by tyrants or a divine right of kings. If we really want to have equality under the law, we need to have a situation where the use of force is diffused and only used in skillful purposes, meaning the enforcement of a common law that allows no one to be above the law. So Chapter 3 of Dr. Vieira's The Bastardy of Martial Law was talking about why, and as students of political economy, we can rise above the din of confusion and the day-to-day data points that might run across the news feed and simply recognize that all conflict is based upon control over resources, with a heavy reminder that time is the only non-renewable resource. Everything else in the material world can be found through production and producing substitutes to whatever might appear to be in shortage. So it's not necessarily that we want to control the oil. We need power production for increasingly electronic uses, devices, and labor-saving machine. And now we're also gaining the benefits of artificial intelligence and language learning models that allow for the processing of information at ever-increasing speed. So rather than focusing on control of oil, we should be focusing on how do we create more power. And again, another distraction is this environmental movement or the fight against climate change. All of that can be dispensed with when you recognize that all of it is about control over resource. And human resources are also extremely important. You are the carbon that they want to reduce, ultimately, whether it be actual elimination of people from the earth or simply reducing them to subjugation. So time is very important, and understanding that resources are the heart of all conflict. How do we rise above conflict? Property rights. Reducing the tragedy of the commons to the greatest extent possible. That's how we optimize legal and security institutions for human flourishing so that people do get to live according to their highest visions of what is good for them. And that's what an enlightened society with pluralistic values signifies. That you can do you, and other people can choose to live how they want, so long as they don't create negative externalities for you or anyone else. And likewise, you have a responsibility to live your highest vision of good, but also not create negative externalities upon other people. In Japanese, the phrase is, meiwaku o kakenai de kudasai. Do not hang your burdens on other people. And that's one of the reasons why the Japanese are so extremely polite. It also is the byproduct of over 1,000 years of warrior leadership. People became very inward focused and very concerned with in-group, out-group dynamics so that they customized their behavior based upon who they were surrounded by so that they do not create an outward appearance of disharmony. I won't go into that too much further, but simply recognizing that courtesy is a means of self-defense, and discipline to be courteous comes about through martial training and martial awareness, recognizing that if you step out of line, it could be your last breath, which leads to one of the dictums that an armed society is a polite society. And yes, I want to live in a polite society. I want to live in a society that is organized, armed, and disciplined to execute a common law where everyone knows what the social order requires. And the way to get there, the means and ends are the same. Organized, armed, and disciplined so that everyone understands the civic responsibility to execute the law, repel invasions, and suppress insurrection. The key nodes or key lines of effort are securing the money, because that is the key element of economy, which automatically eliminates any room for a Federal Reserve note based on a bill of credit that was prohibited in the Constitution. So there should be no Federal Reserve notes being allowed as payments of debts. Going back to a commodity-based standard, which based on history would be gold or silver. And history also shows that politicians cannot be entrusted to enforce a gold standard. Therefore, we have to look to the benefits of technology, and microprocessing, cryptographic security lead to the viability of cyber monies, as the book The Sovereign Individual by Rees-Mogg and Davidson would have us believe. I believe that it is more than likely inevitable that a cyber money like Bitcoin, it's the only one that I would recommend at this point, is the solution to political corruption of the monetary system. And so that takes care of the economic line of effort. Yet it does not alleviate the security/justice side of the coin, meaning political economy is always compound. The two arise together. They cannot be separated. So when it comes to the economic side, the key node there is the monetary system. For the future, I see something like Bitcoin. It's the only one that I recommend to anyone at this point. And on the political side, it comes back to who executes the law, the distribution of arms, and the use of force in society. And you cannot leave that in the hands of politicians and bureaucrats. It will always corrupt the justice system, and you will wind up with neither liberty nor security. So getting back to Dr. Vieira's chapter 3 in the Bastardy of Martial Law, he's talking about why, the ultimate reason why this police state is being built. And we've talked about, again, it's always about control over resource. Now, in the course of any major economic and social crisis, whatever its true cause, for political reasons, if for no others, someone must and eventually will be arraigned as the responsible party in the court of public opinion. That rogue public officials are already preparing to impose martial governance on the American people indicates whom they intend to indict for creating the anarchic conditions that will supposedly make martial governance necessary. Most of the actual culprits accountable for driving common Americans to economic despair, social disorder, civil disobedience, and possibly political rebellion will never be spotlighted. Other than sacrificing a few particularly odious scapegoats from their own camp here and there, rogue officials will never assign any significant portion of the blame for the coming upheavals to the faulty machinery's operators. That is, to themselves, to the two major political parties which elect them, to the big bankers and Wall Street speculators who finance them, or to the big mainstream media which apologize for them. Yet all of them, and only they, will be blameworthy. The foundational fiction which these people and their predecessors have fed to this country for more than a century have always been that America could prosper only under their enlightened leadership, quote unquote. This necessarily entails their permanent, centralized control over this country's economy. That required a partnership, whether symbiotic or parasitic depends upon one's point of view, between public officials and the denizens of the world of high finance, which effectively would elevate the latter above the rule of law, because their minions in the governmental apparatus would write, interpret, and execute the relevant laws, quote unquote, with their particular purposes and interests in mind. On that basis, they designed, built, fastened upon this country, and for some 100 years have operated the machinery of governmentally sponsored central banking. All along, the Federal Reserve System has been their creature. The Federal Reserve Note, their currency, created under their rule, grounded upon their claims of expertise, and hawked to the general public on the basis of their promises that under their so-called scientific management of currency and credit, everything would always work out, not only in their best interest, which naturally was to be expected, but somehow also to the advantage of all other Americans. In the face of the banking cartel's serious failures over the years, such as the banking collapse of 1932 and the general government's seizure of common Americans' gold in 1933, the cartel's preservation, let alone the expansion of its powers, have demanded their establishment of a death grip over the political process, which they have achieved through their two major political parties, and their domination of the mass media and the institutions of public education. Thus ensconced in the chairs of economic and political power, they have imposed upon this country what could be described as the corporative state business model, perforce of which the governmental apparatus has been permanently co-opted as an instrument in their business plans, to their and their clients and partisans' maximum profit, and to everyone else's corresponding loss. Revealingly, the corporative state business model, or as some of its proponents deceptively denote it, capitalism, is in form the mirror image of Marxism, Leninism, in that the latter rests upon the political dictatorship of the working class through its vanguard, the communist intelligentsia, at the supposed expense of bourgeoisie, whereas the former rests upon the economic dictatorship of the moneyed class through its vanguard, the bankers, at the actual expense of the workers of all social and economic classes, and in their ultimate effects on the common man. These two destructive ideologies are perfectly equivalent in all respects, in that each is an implacable antagonist of both the free market economically and a free state politically. More revealingly yet, in specifically American political experience, the corporative state business model is nothing new. Rather, it is simply a modern and particularly pernicious incarnation of what America's founding fathers denounced as faction, because the various institutions in which it is reified all consist of a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, averse to the rights of other citizens, or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. And that comes from the Federalist Number 10, written by James Madison. Inasmuch as the rights of other citizens are legal relationship, no faction can sustain itself for long in the service of some impulse of passion or of interest averse to those rights, except under color of some pseudo-laws that deny enforcement to or affirmatively suppress them. For that reason, from its inception, the corporative state business model has operated according to the political racketeering business model, which entails the subversion and capture of political institutions, and through their perversion into racketeering enterprises, the prostitution of the laws by and for the benefit of these special interests. The Federal Reserve System and the myriad Ponzi schemes, speculative frauds, and other financial swindles which have been erected around it, using it as the fulcrum upon which to apply leverage to the markets, provide the most instructive examples of this criminal conspiracy in action. Illegality is not simply an aspect of these machinations, but instead their essence. They are premised upon illegality, depend upon illegality, function by means of illegality, profit from illegality, and are protected against the consequences of their illegality through further officially sanctioned illegality, all perpetrated under the deceptive color of laws, specially concocted to serve these criminal purposes. But when good men do nothing, evil men triumph. So the money power's machinery of corruption has become so extensive and ingrained within America's economy and political processes, and so interlinked with the governmental apparatus through the Federal Reserve System, that it cannot now be controlled, let alone eliminated by ordinary means. Nonetheless, the parties behind the Federal Reserve System are anything but secure in their ill-gotten positions. For them, the insoluble practice a problem that the corporative state business model is no engine of progress, but instead a time bomb of destruction. Its detractors have long rightly condemned the banking cartel and its allied institutions as unsustainable within an economy based upon free markets and private property, for governmentally sponsored central banking is a denial of both. And if the banking and monetary crises of 1932 and 1933 did not suffice to prove this criticism valid, contemporary events surely supply whatever supplementary evidence may be needed. Who, moreover, would be better situated to know the truth of these matters than the successor parties in interest to the architects and engineers of the Federal Reserve System and allied institutions who created and allowed to develop the preconditions for the nationwide economic collapse now threatening this country? Plainly, just as none other than Victor Frankenstein was personally responsible for the monster he created, even after it ran amok on its own, they, more than anyone else, are responsible for the present crisis, and they know it. Even worse for them is that ever-growing numbers of common Americans are rapidly becoming aware of the big picture too. The realities of the contemporary economic breakdown, both at home and overseas, are being exposed, examined, explained, and excoriated in the financial, alternative, and foreign media every day. Average Americans are finally learning what central banking, fractional reserves, and fiat currency are all about. That certain special interests gain from the operations of the banking cartel, that society in general loses, and that the scheme was established precisely to institutionalize those gains and losses on a permanent basis, can no longer be denied, glossed over, or ridiculed as some sort of mindless conspiracy theory. The massive evidence in the public record establishes a conspiracy fact, or a fact of conspiracy beyond any reasonable doubt. Thus, an intractable political danger for the parties within and allied with the Federal Reserve System has raised its ugly head. Aware that public officials are doing nothing to correct the intolerable situation the banking cartel has caused, because they are the cartel's co-conspirators, common Americans are starting to inquire into what political and legal authority they themselves can and must wield in their own belated defense. The controllers and beneficiaries of the Federal Reserve System know full well that they cannot assuage the American people by correcting the problems of money and banking that beset this country. They have proven unable to prevent or deal with the initial stages of the economic collapse, whether by provision, for they did not see it coming, or by provision, which they did not prepare against, or by their performance to date, for they failed to confine or mitigate it. Apparently mesmerized by their own propaganda, they imagined that through the version of scientific management of currency and credit, they could keep the machinery of their central bank running indefinitely. They assumed that when the Keynesian quip that in the long run we are all dead finally came true, they would be dead, and the long run still an event far in the future, rather than that the long run would suddenly turn up in the present, to find them very much alive and vulnerable. That was wishful, irresponsible thinking, especially from a truly scientific point of view. Hey friends, imagine if you didn't have to battle with a busy mind and a restless body. Imagine if it took just a few minutes a day to set your mindset straight. And imagine if it brought instant results. Less stress, more happiness, greater focus, improved creativity immediately. Well, you can stop imagining. You see, today, I'd like you to know about an awesome audio meditation program called Zen 12. Zen 12 gives you a full hour's worth of deep meditation, all in just 12 minutes. It uses brainwave sounds to speed up the process, and it's genuinely unlike anything you've experienced before. I use this meditation program myself and recommend you do just as much. Just listen and experience the wonderful results. It's meditation for the modern world, for busy people, and it is the most efficient way to get the results that you need. Right now, you can get a free sample of this wonderful technology at everydaysamurai.life/Zen12. Your commitment to a mindfulness practice is essential to bringing your highest faculties online so you can perform your best at all you do, and Zen 12 can help you maximize the results. Check out everydaysamurai.life/Zen12. That's everydaysamurai.life/Zen12. Inasmuch as the vulnerability of the Federal Reserve System has been verified or its invulnerability falsified on more than one occasion. But what else could they have done? To be sure, they might have trotted out the public officials, politicians, and media mouthpieces on their payrolls in order to convince the American people to support the adoption of a new, economically sound and constitutional alternative currency consisting of fixed weights of silver and gold, which could compete with the Federal Reserve note and eventually supplant it, thereby minimizing the damage the collapse of the Federal Reserve System would cause. But that would have meant transforming the present monetary and banking systems in a manner fundamentally at odds with the perpetuation of their economic, political, and social hegemony, and therefore was always and remains today an inadmissible suggestion. The only option viable from their point of view is to attempt to manage the present crisis of central banking, so that they can salvage as much of the Federal Reserve System's foundations as possible in order to provide for reconstruction along the same lines later on. As long as a free market based upon private property is a dominant economic force in this country, however, central banking is ultimately unmanageable, particularly in the midst of a monetary and banking crisis stemming from its inherent defect. Therefore, now more than ever, those aspects of the free market which are incompatible with or even inconvenient for central banking and its allied financial institutions and political operations must be suppressed. As has been done in the past, this can be accomplished most directly by the assertion and application of novel emergency power. Although recourse to emergency powers may stave the worst for a time, the dam will inevitably burst, and all the more violently because the peculiar socio-economic and political quagmires that have oozed up out of previous reliance on emergency powers cannot be cleaned up through the invocation of additional emergency powers alone. For the use of emergency powers to rescue the bankers, financiers, speculators, global investors, dealers in flight capital, and other sharpsters, both domestic and foreign, who have traditionally benefited from the political racketeering business model to the cost of Americans, has created a new and apparently permanent economic division in society. On one side are arrayed the haves, the few but extremely well-heeled beneficiaries of the political racketeering business model, who are pampered as spoiled children by rogue public officials, open-handed employment of emergency powers today. They dispose of extraordinary incomes and wealth, wield political influence wildly disproportionate to their numbers, monopolize the big media as outlets for their propaganda, and pervert social mores so that, steeped in cultural pessimism, despondency, and defeatism, most Americans will be dissuaded from even thinking about challenging the haves' hegemony. On the other strand, the traditional have-nots, those among the working poor whom the political racketeering business model has always economically disenfranchised, along with the new used-to-haves, those within the middle class, whom the collapse of what model has supposedly impoverished in comparison of their former standards of living, but for whom the lifeboats of emergency powers have no room. Now, a free society will inevitably and legitimately consist of both haves and have-nots, relatively speaking. One of the laws of nature and of nature's God is that the poor you always have with you, relatively speaking. So hardly surprising is that the Declaration of Independence identifies as among men's inalienable rights life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, not necessarily the actual attainment of happiness to the fullest degree that every individual might desire. In addition, as a limitation on the powers of the general government, the Constitution's conception of the general welfare presumes, one, that among men are diverse talents, incentives, and circumstances, some individuals and groups will always tend to be better off economically than others, and that it is no business of public officials to interfere in this process by the purpose of imposing equality across the board, either by helping some or by hindering others in their pursuit of happiness. And I'll break here just to simply say that the book by Murray Rothbard, Egalitarianism is a Revolt Against Nature, also speaks to this. This whole obsession with equality has been perverted in the modern sense, and we see this also in the perpetuation of gender dysphoria and other perverse ideologies. People are not equal. People cannot be free and made equal. Equal justice under the law is about preserving private property and the freedom of exchange, the right to acquire property, to be secure in one's own first property, which is the physical body. That type of equality can be enforced, but when trying to make people equal economically in terms of opportunity, that's when oligarchy must reign. There must be some that are forcing this equality in economic terms. But the legal principle of equality under the law is available. And it's only available through a private property legal standard, not the type of forced redistribution of private property that these perverse ideas of egalitarianism hold. I'll continue. But the natural inequalities in economic and social positions that men experience as the result will be acceptable to almost everyone as consistent with the general welfare, only provided that, one, the poor and the middle class enjoy standards of living which enable them to subsist securely and comfortably, even if the rich thrive luxuriantly, and two, such economic and social stratifications as do emerge in society are in fact the products of the workings of the division of labor, free markets, open and honest competition, personal desert, and good fortune without any systematic governmental favoritism extended to the rich directly or indirectly. For, as Americans of the founding era well knew, no man or set of men are entitled to exclusive or separate emoluments or privileges from the community, but in consideration of public service. Today, the haves and the have-nots and the used-to-haves in this country are anything but the products of free markets, honest competition, the division of labor, personal desert, and occasional good luck. Instead, the main focus affecting the distribution of incomes and wealth derived from methodological governmental intervention, which intentionally sabotages free markets, stifles competition, deranges the division of labor, and rewards the unworthy with the unearned. Political good fortune has become the indispensable predicate for the economic success. Such prostitution of public power for private purposes does not generate wealth and poverty, relatively speaking, but instead wealth and poverty in absolute terms. It has opened a widening and unbridgeable chasm between the haves on the one side and the have-nots and the used-to-haves on the other. In a free society, although the rich may be extremely well off, the middle class will be quite well off, and even the poor will be sufficiently well off that they can afford to lead decent lives. In the politically fixed society which prevails today, the rich are supremely well off, the middle class only marginally well off at best, and losing significant ground every day, while the poor are so badly off that their plight cries out to heaven as an affront to human dignity. And again, this is a function of fiat money, the Federal Reserve note, being able to emit bills of credit unbacked by genuine savings or a genuine monetary standard like gold, silver, denominated according to fixed weights and measures, or the ultimate hard money, which is Bitcoin. Under the fiat monetary system, you have what are known as quintillionaires. Those that receive the money first can benefit before the economic environment adjusts to the new monetary standard or the new monetary quantity. This is Richard Cantillon's theory and recognition that money does not flow evenly into all sectors of an economy or throughout society, that some people that get the money first, meaning those that are closer to the political spigot, are better off than those that receive it last. And those on fixed incomes or those that are living off of savings are the worst off, because inflationism destroys saving. Just having a Federal Reserve system with a mandate to target 2% inflation is a crime committed against everyone on fixed incomes or that are expecting their savings to sustain themselves. And the Federal Reserve fractional banking fiat monetary system will perpetuate until we, the people, execute the law and insist upon a sound money standard based on fixed weights and measures. Continuing. In the years immediately following World War II, the haves were tolerated, and to a certain extent even respected, because the corporative state system they had set up and then had administered in their own behalf was not obviously a zero-sum game. Although it did not especially benefit the great mass of citizens in comparison to how it enriched and empowered the haves, it did not appear to harm the average American either. And I'll break here just to say, imagine after World War II, when the rest of the industrialized world had experienced massive destruction, the United States was really the only remaining industrial power. Therefore, manufacturing exploded in the United States while the rest of the world was rebuilding just to catch up to where they were prior to the war. So of course Americans benefited from the aftermath of World War II. Returning to the text. While it was working, the scheme appeared to enable most Americans to make slow and steady, if not spectacular, economic gains which seemed to be permanent. Those who were soon to be driven to the ranks of the used-to-haves and then of the have-nots failed to realize the true nature of their predicament, and to what end it would inevitably lead. They were the victims of what Friedrich Bastiat famously described as the seen and the unseen. The seen was apparent prosperity on an apparently permanent basis. The unseen was the foundation of sand, indeed, the veritable sinkhole upon which this ostensible but ultimately delusive affluence was erected. Next to no one warned that America's economy would have been far better off had it been organized on a firmly constitutional basis, which absolutely excluded the political racketeering business model, and in particular prohibited the various bubbles, Ponzi schemes, and other Wall Street speculative chicanery the Federal Reserve System encouraged and facilitated from its beginning, and especially during the last several decades. Under such circumstances, actual rather than merely apparent progress would have been made, because the underpinnings of America's economy would have been rendered secure. Real wealth in terms of productive facilities turning out durable goods and paying high wages, rather than evanescent card castles consisting of paper investments, bottomed upon ever-mounting debt, would have accumulated, and the distribution of income among economic classes would have been equitable, rather than grotesquely distorted in favor of the have. But those few who issued such admonitions went unheeded, if they were not derided as conspiracy theorists and crackpot. Nonetheless, the situation might have not turned out as badly as it has had the haves treated common Americans with a modicum of consideration. Even today, if their own stores of wealth and sources of income were secure, common Americans would likely tolerate in silence the hyperbolically bloated incomes and exorbitant sybaritic lifestyles of the super-rich. As typical factions, though actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, averse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community, the haves have forgot, if they ever knew, that persons in positions of economic and political leadership cannot always take in order to assuage their own avarice, but instead must provide and secure some significant benefits to the community. Although through their subversion of the government they illegitimately elevated themselves into the position of a self-selected, self-perpetuating economic and political nobility, the haves disregarded the principle of noblesse oblige, that with power comes responsibility. They surely remembered the adage, the poor you always will have with you, but left out their consideration the implicit command which follows it, namely, and whensoever you will, you can do them good. Rather, they concluded that it was unnecessary to maintain American society as a going concern. Instead, that they could treat it as an expendable resource to be squeezed like an orange for its juice, and the rind then thrown away. And they had no fear then that even so mistreated common Americans would ever muster the spunk of a mongrel dog which, after too much abuse, bites the hand that refuses to feed it. And I will conclude this session of the reading now, knowing that there is more in Chapter 3 that describes the ultimate reasons for why the police state is being built. Again, remembering that what we talked about prior to the reading, as well as what was discussed by Dr. Vieira, that most of it is in economic terms. All conflict is based upon conflict over a resource. Scarce resources with alternative uses is what Thomas Sowell and other economists describe what is economic. But economics is incomplete without the political wing, and politics is always based on the use of force. Use of force is always about the use of resource. So political economy are always dependent upon each other. They are always present. You cannot examine economics without politics, and you cannot examine politics without understanding economics. They have dependent arising, which is also a commonly used Buddhist term. You recognize that everything is connected. And going back to this idea of fiat money and the Federal Reserve System that allows for the distortions in the economics of society to unfold, especially since 1971, when the United States, as the de facto international reserve currency, disconnected from the gold standard. And since then, monetary and economic chaos has ensued with more swings of the boom-bust cycle. You can understand this if you study causal realist political economy in the Austrian school. Being untethered to a commodity-based monetary standard leads to chaos because prices no longer reflect the relative scarcity of the goods and services that they are supposed to represent. We can take this into our martial art and recognize that what's been said before, especially by James Williams, sensei of Nami-ryu Aikiheiho, that tension in the body is like white noise in the mind. And the mind must be clear so that you can perceive threats accurately and respond to them effectively. So clarity of mind is requisite to understanding signals, and prices in an economy are the signals that allow for people to make rational decisions about resource allocation, which, again, going back to the greatest resource is time. How you focus your time is the most important thing that you can do in your day. And that requires sacrifice because every expenditure of time is to deny your focus toward everything else that you could be doing in that set period. There are no absolutes. There are only trade-offs. We live in a world of relativity. Time, space, and form are inherently conditions-based. They are conditioning the absolute. If you believe in an absolute power, an infinite mind, a godhead, whatever your orientation might be, science agrees just as much as the spiritual systems do. There is an infinite mind and an infinite thinker, a supreme intelligence back of all things. However, that infinity must compress down into the concrete, into the definite, in order to have this experience. So we can speak metaphysically that human beings are infinitely spiritual. However, they are having a very human experience, which requires collapsing the infinite down into the definite. So to be a true human being is to appreciate the differences, to appreciate contrast, and yes, to discriminate, to not think in terms of the absolute, which is another skill of the political economist. We must discriminate between this and that. We must recognize alternative uses for scarce resource. And that is the way to build a rational and just society. Yes, discrimination, recognizing everyone has different preferences. Yet there are certain things that allow for equality under law. And that is, again, only available through a private property legal standard. And those that gain control of deciding how law gets enforced will always be perverted by that power. Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Law must be enforced by everyone equally. That's the militia standard. The whole body of the people, organized, armed, and disciplined to execute the law, repel invasions, and suppress insurrections, including, and most importantly, those violations of law and those insurrections against constitutional order committed by corrupt officials. But it all starts with your use of time, how you focus, how you perceive things, and what you don't give your time or attention to. Just like electoral politics, nothing's going to change by voting harder. There needs to be institutional change. Those key institutions, again, money and militia. Until those key institutions change, very little will change in the political landscape. So I hope this gives you something to think about. It reminds you of the importance of how you focus your mind, your time, your attention, and your energy, and to think more clearly about political economy and how it relates to your day-to-day activities. So, friends, we hope you have enjoyed this episode of Everyday Samurai and look forward to seeing you next time. If you like what you've heard here, be sure to like, subscribe, and share, and build that community of enlightened warriors in service to liberty. Until next time, stay sharp, stay aware, and be well.